So they have to bounce off each other for 3 days. And obviously over that time, some people drive you up the wall, and probably you drive some other people up the wall. And as it got to the business end of the 3 days, and thinking about what you wanted to work on or who you wanted to work with, I thought Marisa was sat at the table, and I thought I can work with her because she's one of the more sane people I've met over the last 3 days, without knowing her background, etc. And having worked for probably over a year now on a project with Marisa, and it's taken a long time. The project didn't last a year, but working together took a year. She's still a very, very lovely, a very sane person. So Marisa originally qualified as an engineer. So she's got that engineering, and she's got a manufacturing background. So obviously what she did then was do a PhD in services. Yeah, so she did a PhD in services and call centers, etc., etc. And maybe that's when she went to the dark side of qualitative research rather than quantitative research through that PhD. So she does that. I should have said she is an associate dean for learning enhancement at Strathclyde University. And so that shows you her commitment to teaching and the value they place on her teaching, and she's won awards for teaching, etc. So she's an associate dean now. She leads this EPSRC funded research that we're going to hear about now. And because she obviously doesn't have enough to do or has no life of her own, she's also on the editorial board of the International Journal of Management Reviews. So if you're interested in the publishing in the International Journal of Management Reviews, then you can maybe ask a question about that, or learning enhancement, or hopefully the core of our subject here today, people with disabilities and how they're treated at the moment in our discipline of management studies. If you're not from management studies, I think what Marisa's going to talk about is equally applicable in other areas. For the context of getting a publication out of it, we probably, that's why we talk about management studies. So I'm really pleased to have Marisa as a speaker. Do you know how long you're going to talk for, Marisa?
I don't know. 20 minutes, half an hour. You just shut me up when you need to, Nigel. Just cut me off, mute me.
Okay, so as you see, Marisa is very easygoing and does have what we in the South can call a Glaswegian accent. So don't speak too fast, because if Glaswegian you can kind of understand, but if you get two or more Glaswegians together and they start talking fast, you got more chance with a language you can't speak. Anyway, so that's enough for me. I'm going to shut up now and I'll hand you over to Marisa.
Thank you, Nigel. That was a lovely introduction. Yes, I am very aware I have an accent, so if anybody needs me to slow down, please just tell me to slow down. I will not be offended. If there's anything unclear, please just ask. Really, really informal. We'll take you through. So this is work that we presented at the recent BAM conference, the British Academy of Management. So hopefully you'll be interested. Please ask questions as we go through. Happy to do that. Strathclyde is also a Zoom organisation, which makes me nervous when I come on Teams to present, because I'm always scared I'm going to show something I shouldn't. So hopefully you can see my screen. There we go.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Thank you. So like Nigel said, we've been working together, probably over a year, on our Interact project, and I'll explain a little bit what Interact is. So Interact is an ESRC funded network, basically, that is trying to put humans back at the heart of manufacturing, and digital manufacturing specifically. We work in a broader project, like Nigel was saying. We have colleagues from the University of Wolverhampton, obviously Nigel from London Met. We also have colleagues in engineering from the University of Cambridge and the University of York. So a kind of multidisciplinary project. What we're presenting today, though, is the kind of social science management part of the project, and it's our kind of initial output of a literature review that we've been working on as part of the wider project. The wider project, like I said, is really looking at the use of digital tools and how those tools can be useful, supportive in making make manufacturing an inclusive place to work. And we took inclusion at its kind of broadest sense in that sandpit, Nigel, if you remember, really looked at everything, all of the kind of protected characteristics. But again, for the purposes of narrowing the work down, we started to look at disabled people specifically. And then we came to kind of thinking about maybe how disabled people work with AI interfaces or different types of manufacturing technologies, and how that might impact disabled people's inclusion into the workplace, specifically manufacturing workplaces. So just a little bit of background from the project that we're going to present just now. So we're not presenting the whole project, just the literature review that we've been looking at. You will be unsurprised, given the title of your centre, that diversity in management research has been popular, has been a topic of interest for many, many years. There are a few literature reviews already in the area of ED&I broadly, also maybe focusing on gender studies, race, but there's something that Taliti and, sorry for my pronunciation, Uzblinking, actually talk about as a pecking order. So even within the EDI field, if you like, within management studies, there seems to be a bit of a top trumps or pecking order, whatever you want to call it, but there seems to be a kind of ranking of what categories of diversity are more popular. And things like disability seem to be in that less popular category. There's not been as much work done in that area from kind of literature review perspective, and has actually been identified as being an under-researched topic within the mainstream management field. That's quite surprising when you think about it, because 15% of the world's population are disabled, right? So that's 1 billion people living with disabilities. It's the world's largest minority group, if you look at it in that sense, but it's also one of the largest minority group that anyone can join. So the kind of context for our Interact project is, yes, there are disabled people.
I'm doing have to attend this disability, whatever it is.
So there is, it is the world's largest minority, like I said, but it's also the one that anybody has the potential to join. So there's, in the critical disability studies field, people talk about being pre-disabled. So instead of saying non-disabled, people actually will start to refer to people as pre-disabled, because in that context, scholars say you're only one accident away from being disabled or one health condition away from being disabled. In our manufacturing project, what we've also found is the working population is aging. As we all know, we're going to have to work longer. You know, retirement age is stretching and stretching. I think I'll be about 90 by the time I get to retire. So we are going to be faced with an aging population, and with age comes long-term ill health, comes other conditions. So it is an interesting area that we should be looking at. That's even beyond talking about the disability employment gap and the disability pay gap, which is existing out there as well. So what we wanted to do with this literature review was essentially look at, with every literature review, what has been written, specifically around about how disabled people experience work. So we were looking for disabled people's voices within the management studies. So within the studies that are published, can we see voice? Can we see what's been written from that perspective? We also were, you'll see when we come to it in the next couple of slides, but we were also really interested in the mainstream management disciplines, so business and management disciplines, what's been written in the mainstream, because we are aware that there are disability focused journals, but we wanted to see what does the mainstream management journals say about disability and disabled people's experiences of work. We adopted, as a kind of organising framework or an explanatory framework in some way, we adopted a structuration perspective, because it was becoming apparent as we started to review the work that actually there was other kind of pressures at play within the field. So we wanted to see within the management literature that we can see, are the kind of views of disability, are the social structures of disability being maintained, or are we as management scholars actually trying to transform the work experience for disabled people? So that was kind of one of the things we had in our mind as we started with the review. Again, the approach that we took was a kind of, I suppose you would call it a semi-systematic review, and that we were very clear on the key terms that we were looking for. We were very focused on the journals that we were looking in. We had a specific date range, so worked through some of those kind of criteria. So I know all of the issues with the CABS journal ranking, the star ratings, but no matter your views on it, no matter what you think about it, it is still used as a kind of marker of quality. So because we were interested in the mainstream, because we are interested in what the kind of, you know, quality journals were saying about things, we made the decision to look at 3-star and above papers within that CABS guide. We also specifically looked between 2010 and 2020. So those of you that are interested in disability work probably know that the Equalities Act came in 2010, but that also coincided with updates to the Disability Act in other parts of the world. So places like India, China, the US started to put in more legislation round about disability rights within various parts of the world. So we had that date range to try and see, is there a big step change? Now that these legislations have, legislative policies have come out, is there any change? Can we see more, for want of a better term, progressive studies on people with disabilities? So that was our date range. You can see here we use these search strings, not volunteering, because what we were finding in our initial search, the initial search activity, was we were getting a lot of papers coming through that was disabled people volunteering, or it was also about non-disabled people volunteering with disabled people. So we tried to exclude some of those to get us to a more meaningful work, rather than disability kind of volunteering and volunteering for charities, that kind of thing. From that initial search term, we got nearly 1,400 papers, and then we put our inclusion criteria on that disability had to be mentioned in the abstract, and then had to also be related to disability inclusion in the workplace. So again, not things like people being disabled due to workplaces, if that makes sense. So some of the papers that were coming up was like repetitive strain injuries within work and things like that. So we tried to look at the disability inclusion in the workplace. From that, we ended up with 94 papers in the review that we then, each of us read the papers in detail, draw out the kind of key themes, the key findings, and started to look at kind of the content of the papers, if that makes sense. So again, apologies for this very busy table, but you can see here the journals that we looked at and the rank of the journals on the CABS list. You can see that we picked certain areas. So we tried to look at business management, we've got org studies as well, and operations and technology. Given that our project is focusing in on the manufacturing industry, we thought the inclusion of operations and technology management was also important here. You can see in the brackets are the papers that ended up being included into our final study. You can see some numbers are pretty high, and then there's no relevant papers. And that was round about disability being used or disabled being used to mean, so the disablement of something rather than disabled people. So when we actually went in and looked at the abstracts, we could see that the keywords were throwing up different kind of subjects and topic areas. So after reading each of the abstracts, the final versions that went then into the final review are in the brackets. It's really not surprising so much that most of it came through. You can see just by glancing that most of the papers coming through were in the HRM kind of field or employment management field. Very few in the kind of mainstream management papers, or very, very few in operations management and technology management. So the next step was reviewing obviously each of the papers, and this was a kind of thematic analysis, organising framework that we looked at. And we started to realise as we were reviewing the papers that some of them were at different levels. So we came up with the levels here of the macro, meso, micro. So micro organisation, micro individual, and then started to think about, well, what are the key themes or sub-themes that we are seeing in each of the papers. So we used this as our kind of, first step of analysis. So you can see some of the kind of key themes coming out. Unsurprising that the neoliberal economy was top, and kind of underpinned a lot of what we found. But then things like modes of work, so the type of work disabled people do. Again, in the HR, there was so much written in HR practices round about recruitment, so inclusive recruitment practices, the management, the health, the well-being, all of these kind of things. Accommodations was a massive theme that came out, talking about, do people actually ask for accommodations being disabled, and the impact that might have on their career progression and that kind of thing. So there was quite an interesting spread of topics coming out in the 94 papers that we looked at. Then down into the kind of individual area, you can see things like ableist workplaces and the kind of lived experience coming out. I have to say that was was lesser than the more processual or structural aspects. There was very, very few papers that actually had disabled people's lived experience in them. There was one really fascinating paper that was written by a disabled academic, actually, and it was one of the few papers that a disabled person's voice was clearly heard through the paper. So from our thematic analysis, like I said, we adopted a structuration perspective and we were trying to make sense of it. So this is all a bit of work in progress, and that we're trying to make sense of, are we just seeing the same things being repeated? Is there anybody saying things, you know, in a different way? As disabled people's voices heard? Can we see their agency within the current literature, mainstream literature? And it seems a bit of a depressing kind of picture here, but this is what the mainstream management literature is kind of telling us, that most of the work that we're seeing about disability inclusion in work is influenced by this neoliberal ideal worker. And that neoliberal ideal worker is I don't like this term, it's not a term I would use, but they use the able-bodied person. Obviously, we would normally talk about being non-disabled or pre-disabled, but they talk about this ideal worker who's productive, you know, that can meet the targets of the business. This is then leading to the othering of disabled people. So we see it in some of the kind of lived experience work. Again, that kind of the things we see that are perpetuating is the labour market, again being influenced by that neoliberal context, which then makes workplace accommodations being something that is something to be bargained with, debated, discussed. And it leads to individuals then either disclosing or suppressing their disability, which is okay when you have a hidden or an invisible disability, but when your disability is visible, you know, some of that gets taken away from you. And then underpinning a lot of this is the kind of medical model of disability. We found it coming through very clearly in a lot of the studies that there is still this medicalised norm. So even in the way some of the studies were set up, they were set up in very much, you know, we will tell you about the medical aspect and how that medical aspect influences work, rather than taking a more social model of disability and kind of flipping it round. So it doesn't look so great in this kind of diagram, but it then gives us a kind of motivation of, well, how can we do better within our own work, I think. So like I said, we started looking at this. We found that a lot of people, because of that ability and seeing what people are able to do, then feeds down into kind of more ableism affecting, you know, what people are perceived to be able to do, whether they would want to tell their colleagues about being disabled and those kind of things. So the kind of ableism seems to be apparent within the studies that we've seen. And again, starting to think about, again, the neoliberalism underpinning everything is when we see disability inclusion, it's often couched in the business case. So it is too expensive. There is too many risks to employ disabled people. And loads of the studies highlighted the productivity issue, if you like, and that, yes, it would be great to have disabled people working, but we feel that the reasonable adjustments, the accommodations that you need will cost us money. Disabled people are not going to be as productive. And we see that coming out in a lot of the studies. Again, one of the things that came out really strongly in the findings was round about the kind of deservingness. So there was a lot of studies that spoke about, you know, who should get benefits, who should be supported into work, the kind of deservingness, if that makes sense. So what type of disability should be supported, which type of disability shouldn't be supported. And also there was a lot round about what we would call sheltered employment. Some of the more critical studies would talk about it as the ghettoisation of work for disabled people. So we've seen that in the past with organisations like Remploy and things like that, where they will set up an organisation that is just employing disabled people, so not working in mainstream organisations, but kept within a segregated unit, you know, to work together. You see it in some of there's now a trend for kind of things like cafes, where they may employ people with learning disabilities as well. So not in the mainstream, but much more kind of benevolent marginalisation is kind of what we talk about. There was also a lot of work written round about the kind of what type of jobs were appropriate for disabled people. And there was a lot about the kind of dirty work aspect. So interestingly, that paper I spoke about the academic, the author of that was actually talking about academia being dirty work, and the dirty jobs that she was kind of given as a disabled person within the academy. So there's been a few things written round about that, and what we're seeing is a lot of the kind of work that's been discussed, debated within the mainstream management journals is perpetuating a lot of these kind of stereotypes, for wanting a better word. So what's the kind of key conclusions here? Is that agency is difficult in a way. Disabled voices are not really being heard within the mainstream management studies that we are seeing. Like I said, there was a few papers, but not as many as I had expected. A lot of the papers were using disability employment data figures that collected by government level and things like that. But what we found, again, it will be no surprise, but that neoliberalist idea really shaping what is work, what is the ideal worker, what does disability mean within the workplace. So we are up against it in a way, if that makes sense. But we're seeing that a lot of that kind of bias, the stereotyping is really embedded in the work that we're seeing. Like I said, just a caveat, we are just looking at the mainstream management journals. I know other more critical journals and disability work journals will have a different view, but we were interested in what the mainstream were saying. So thinking about our future work, like I said, this is part of a much bigger project. As we started working through the literature review, some of the studies were calling for this more ethnographic way of inquiring with disabled people. So not on disabled people, but with and co-created with disabled people. So some of the journals that have a bit more of the sociological slant were basically talking about that much more co-creation, collaborative approach with disabled people on this rather than about them. And again, that direct sensory contact to co-create with disabled people. So a lot of disabled people have had studies done on them or of them. And so I was glad to see there was some calls coming out to say, actually, let's do this in a much more inclusive manner. So we're proud to say that we live our ethos. So just so you can, I think about where our project has gone. This is the National Manufacturing Institute in Scotland. So if you've ever gone into Glasgow Airport, this is a big purple building. If you're ever coming into Glasgow Airport soon, look for the big purple building. And this is our National Manufacturing Research Centre. Strathclyde are an anchor institution for it, but we took a group of disabled students out to Ennis to interact with the technology, to speak to them about technology, to speak to them about their experiences of work and life, and what can make things better for them. So we are trying to live those principles that we've taken from our literature review. So thank you very much. That is me. I hope I didn't go over my time too much. I'll stop sharing, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Well, I thought that was great. So, but I'm probably a bit biased. But Marisa, could you just expand a bit on what you mean by medicalisation?
Yeah, so within disability language, let's say, there's a medical model of disability which focuses on the person, their condition, trying to solve the medical aspect of it. So if somebody is in a wheelchair, they will say, they're in a wheelchair, their legs don't work. Let's see how we can fix the legs. Rather than saying, actually, if we make our buildings accessible and we start to think about the social model of disability, it's actually not the disability that creates the issues in accessing work or society. It's often either the physical place or the kind of managerial mindset that stops people. So a lot of the time with the medicalised model, Nigel, it will be, they will look at what the person cannot do and they'll start from that point. So starting from the medical condition and then trying to kind of solve that rather than looking at infrastructure or looking at architecture, processes, those kind of things. So yeah, I think we've had comments before about, oh, you should have some doctors involved in your project. And I'm thinking, this has nothing to do with doctors or medical stuff. So still with disability, there's still that view of let's get underneath the condition rather than looking at society in general.
Thank you. Right. Anybody would like to ask a question or raise a point?
Hiya.
Marisa, can I ask something?
Yes, please.
What do you mean the neoliberal policies? What do you mean exactly? And because that wasn't very obvious from the coding. And then in contrast to what? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, so the kind of neoliberal economy where productivity and profit is everything, that seems to underpin much of the studies. So you are only useful to my business if you are going to be productive and don't cost me money, is kind of what we've seen in a lot of the studies. A lot of the studies have actually called out the neoliberal policies of governments and things like that. So if you're, I'm trying to be political here. I had a colleague say to me, well, we wouldn't include disabled people because they're not economically active. So it's that kind of mindset that seems to be underpinning a lot of the work.
Yeah.
Don't know if that answers your question, Konstantinos.
It does, yeah. But the other thing I want to ask is, because I'm not a qual guy, so what does structuration mean? It's interesting to me. It's obviously you're trying to go from one level to another, but can you just explain it a bit?
Yeah, so structuration is about, so there's social structures that make up the world. Okay, sorry, this anybody who's a sociologist will be crying at the moment. But there's structures, social structures, processes that make up the world. Okay, but there's also you and I, agents, that change those processes, change those structures. So on a very basic level, structuration is trying to look at the interaction between the agents, so the agency, and the structures and kind of more social processes that, so the societal norms, for instance, when people talk about societal norms, they're normally kind of the structures that underpin how we do work. What does work mean? But then you have agents, individuals who can push against those structures to some degree. So sorry to any sociologists, I've probably done that very high level.
That's very interesting. The sociology of organizations, that's very interesting.
Yeah. So we're trying to give disabled people more of a voice, Konstantinos, in our wider project, because a lot of the times the structures and the social norms have been developed by non-disabled people. And actually then to try and get agency and voice from disabled people is a challenge at the moment.
So that's why you need both macro, meso, and micro accounts, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. To make fundamental change, yes.
Yeah, That's interesting, Marisa. Yeah.
Thank you. Arvind?
Hi, lovely presentation. Thanks a lot. And I was wondering, like, I mean, what's the role of technology? Like, I mean, did you look at the role of technology? Like, technology can be like enabler, or like how technology can contribute?
So not for the literature review. So in the literature review, there was very few studies about the technology aspect. For the wider project, we are looking at how technology can support disabled people into work. So we've been looking at different interfaces. So we've been looking at collaborative robotics. So how cobots can work with disabled people. Excuse me. So the person that you saw in the photos at the end, his name's Connor, and Connor can work with a touch screen. So if you have a cobot, a collaborative robot with a touch screen, then disabled people can be included. But there's so much work to be done round about making other aspects. So you can make, you know, the digital side really accessible.
Yeah.
But if the building, you can't get into the building.
Yeah.
Yeah, then in the wider study, we found things like no disabled toilets in workplaces. So, but yes, we are looking at the technology as part of the wider project. That's exactly what we're looking at. So, using things like augmented reality.
Yes, that's what I was coming actually up. That's good.
Yeah. So we're working with a company, and they project onto a workbench like an augmented reality, and they take the person through what they should be doing. So if it's, you know, placing something, certain points, it takes them through step by step. So if somebody has a learning disability, for instance, it could work alongside them and support them in undertaking the task.
Yeah. So like I was thinking, then is it going to be easy to commercialize these technologies for like a common, like, I mean, all disabled people, or just only for few people like who are in the limelight, or who like ask for these things?
Yeah, that's been a big tension in our findings. Okay, so like I said, we've been working with engineers on this project as well. And engineers come from that, let's just focus on one condition. Right? And that's very medicalized, because you're like, oh, let's just focus on that one condition. And what we're saying is, can we broaden it out and make good inclusive design of technologies? So for instance, on a machine interface, if you've got a CNC machine and its interface, okay, is that readable? Can that read aloud for somebody who maybe has dyslexia? Yeah, because, you know, 25% of the population are neurodiverse. So have something like autism or dyslexia, dyscalculia. If you have something like that, or can it be changed the colour so that it's better readable or things? So we're trying to move away from think about in narrow categories, but nobody's talking about this just now. So a lot of the kind of machine tool manufacturers are still designing for the typical person. Yeah, but it's challenging. It's so challenging.
That's good. No, lovely. Thank you. Thanks.
That's a great question.
Any other comments or questions? Clarifications? Okay, well, we're nearly on the hour. So, Abu.
Mohammed's asked a question, Nigel. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Sorry, lovely presentation. Thank you very much. I have a few questions related to getting maybe primary data. I can see you done obviously based on secondary, and good way to do literature review, definitely. But in terms of real disability, in terms of finding out reality, what's happening, I think the two primary source could be very, very important. One of them, obviously, council, local council. Other one could be related to, army, army-related medical and those kind of things. I think they're very, very important source, and we'll get very current data about it. And probably that could give you practical solution to the problem as well. Am I right? Please let me know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, so we have done primary data as well. So obviously today I'm just presenting the literature review, but we've worked with disabled young people. So we have worked with a lot of disabled people. We've also worked with disabled staff network within the universities to get their views, their opinions, those kind of things. We've also interviewed some large manufacturing companies and small manufacturing companies to kind of get their views, their ideas on it. What myself and Nigel didn't point out was this was just a pilot project. So we only had a very short period of time and quite a small pot of money. But yeah, we're looking to see how we could expand it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, final call. Any other questions, clarifications, comments? No, great. I'm so pleased that we had you here, Marisa. And I should have said that Marisa is has been the principal investigator on this project. I and the others are co-investigators, and yes, we're trying to take it forwards to get a bigger project. But obviously, that's in the hands of the gods of the councils, etc., etc. But thank you ever so much, Marisa, for a really beautiful explanation of what we've been doing, and the findings, etc. Lovely.
Thank you, Nigel. And if anybody wants to get in touch, you can go via Nigel or myself. So thank you.
Certainly, yeah. Okay, and so thank you all, everybody, for coming to watch this, to listen to it, to take it in, I hope, and witness it, and see you all soon. Okay, thanks very much, Marisa.
Thank you. Bye-bye.